Everybody loves somebody, somebody. Dean is feeling a little too good tonight, so while he's pulling himself together, he asked me to come out here and sort of get things started. So if you'll just bring the cards up a little closer there. All right, now let's see. Oh, I feel good tonight. I'm kind of tired. I tossed and turned all night last night. I fell asleep in the clothes dryer. I say I fell asleep in the clothes dryer.
Who locked me out of my dressing room?
Well, I don't see how anybody could do that, Dean.
You can't see out. Now,
No.
Jimmy, why did you do it, thing like
But
that?
now that you're out, here's your key.
Thank you very, very much. And now that you're out here, why don't you finish this monologue for me, huh, Jimmy?
Oh. Well, and now, here's a fella to tell you who's on Dean's show tonight.
The Dean Martin Show, starring George Gobel, Shecky Greene, Jimmy Stewart, and Les Brown and his band of renown.
Nobody, baby, up until I met you. People used to call me nobody's baby. I was feeling so blue. Oh, when you came along, my life was a song. I thought that my lonely would end. Then you went away and left me to stay, and I'm nobody's baby again. Nobody's baby again. I keep missing you more and more. Nobody's baby again. You're the one I've been living for. People used to call me a nobody's baby till they saw me with you. Walking in a daydream, hoping that maybe all my dreams would come true. I planned every move, I tried hard to prove that even a loser can win. Oh, I don't have a knack, my lonely is back, and a nobody's baby again. Nobody's baby again. I keep missing you more and more. Nobody's baby again. You're the one I've been living for. I planned every move, I tried hard to prove that even a loser can win. But I don't have a knack, my lonely is back, and nobody's baby again. Nobody's baby. Nobody's baby. Nobody's baby again.
Thank you. Oh, that kid sings beautiful. When Whistler's mother heard him, she went off her rocker. Well, I sure done a great show for you tonight. My wonderful pal, Jimmy Stewart, is here. He's such a great actor and such a dignified man. Yeah, one night, he caught his wife watching Peyton Place, and he made a citizen's arrest. My pal George Gobel is here. George is such a sweet guy, but, oh, is he shy. Yeah, George's idea of a big evening is to go to a topless restaurant and wonder how the girls look with their sweaters on. And another funny guy, Shecky Green, is here. I'll tell you something about Shecky. For years, he's been wanting a car like the one I ride around in. So for Christmas, I bought him a police car. Hi, played golf with my next guest the other day, and while we were walking around the course, he told me a story about something that happened to him once, and I asked him to come out and tell you this. And this story sure proves the funniest things in life happen for real. Ladies and gentlemen, the beautiful Mr. George Gobel.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be here. The thing the Dean was talking about, it wasn't funny to me at all at the time. It was an opening night at a hotel, and it was the first time I played there, and you're always nervous on an opening night. And this night I started getting ready, like, 2 hours before the show, because I don't want to be late or anything. And I come out of the shower, and I'm walking around the room, and I haven't got any clothes on at all. Nothing. And I'm walking around the room like that. It's my room, right? So I walk around the room, and I haven't got any clothes on, and I'm nervous. But that's not what made me nervous. That didn't bother me at all, because I take showers like that all the time. I find it's neater that way, actually. But anyway, the point is I'm walking around the room, and no clothes on, and the room is kind of steamed up. So now I figure if I would open the window, that'd be a pretty shrewd move. So I go over to open this window. Now, anybody else in the whole world can open this window with 2 fingers. They go like that. I got no chance with that window. There's no way that window's going to open for me. Now, this gets me mad, because I'm not in that bad a shape. And I'm giving it a tug, because now I get stubborn. And when I'm stubborn, I'm going to open this window now if it takes every cow in the barn. It doesn't make any difference. And I'm fighting it, and every time I give it a tug, I'm bumping my head on the glass. And that gives me a headache. And then I really got mad, because I hate headaches. I hate them. No, I really do. Some people just don't like them. I hate them. Ooh, I hate headaches. I wish I hadn't even brought it up now, because see, I almost died from a headache one time. That's why I hate them. I mean, I didn't almost die from the headache itself, because you don't die from a headache. You know that. Everybody knows that. Crime and Nentleys. But anyway, but see what happens, I wanted to get better, and, the pump in your stomach? Well, with me, the little trap door got rusted shut, and I almost buffered myself to death. Ever since then, I hate headaches. So now I want to get this. So now, you know what I do? I get my foot up on the windowsill, like that. That's for leverage. And like I say, not stitch one did I have on. And I'm standing in the window like that. I do about 6 or 8 minutes right there in the window. And I don't even know if I'm getting any laughs either. That's probably Lord knows I should have been. Now, all of a sudden, and don't ask me why, because I don't know, but all of a sudden the window just goes, could you look like, and there. Well, I'm telling you, I make that Batman look like a bum. Because my room was on the 14th floor. Now, the fall itself, strangely enough, didn't particularly bother me. It was that walk back through the lobby that kind of... Because unfortunately, I'm one of them fellows who just cannot walk past a magazine stand. That's all there is. I can't do it. So now I'm standing there and I'm looking at the magazines, and I'll tell you something else. No, I won't tell you either. I don't have to tell you everything, but all of a sudden I get this strange feeling, I get a feeling that somebody is looking at me, Now, I want to find out who. I know somebody is, because I can tell, but I want to find out without being obvious or making a spectacle of myself, So what I do, I run a very casual little check. I kind of turn a page like that, and I turn with it a little bit. Sure enough, there's a lady that runs a magazine stand right there, and she's looking at me. Well, now I get embarrassed, because I didn't have any money. And she knew I didn't have any money, too. Oh, she knew, and I knew she knew that I didn't have any money, because that's the kind of a look she's giving me. You know, one of those, you look like you ain't got no money kind of looks, you know. So I figure if that's the way she wants to be remembered, she's writing her own ticket, right? Because that's a very poor attitude for someone dealing with the public, I think. So I release her right now. You know, I put the magazine back in the rack. Now, I walk across the lobby there as casually as possible under the circumstances, you know. Because if you run, you're going to attract attention, you know. So I walk all the way across the lobby. I get to the elevators, and they got a whole bunch of elevators there, and one elevator door was open, thank goodness. And I'm glad it was, because I'd have walked in if it was closed. What do you think about that? But I walk in, I said, 14, please. Hey, did you ever notice this? When things are going bad, they ain't going to get no better. You ever notice that? Because if there's one thing I know in this whole world, it's that I said 14 in a loud, clear voice. Besides that, you'd figure that this girl operating the elevator here would assume that I am in somewhat of a hurry. Now, wouldn't you figure that? No, I figure that, yeah, but no, we just stand there, and I don't know how long we stand, you know, because... No, I don't know. You can't tell at a time like this. No, you're not in condition. Did you ever get in one of them spots when 5 seconds is like a lifetime, you know? And we're standing there, and mostly I didn't know what to do with my hands. I look around the elevator a little bit like this, you know. There's not too many places to look in an elevator, you know, once around like that, that's about it. You know, so now we finally get started, and don't you know that elevator stops every single floor up to the 14th? If I'm lying, I'm dying. Every single floor. And the funny part of it is, nobody got off. Now, you can't tell me there wasn't something a little kinky going on there. I don't say anything. I mean, I stand there like a little soldier, just like this. That's all I do here. No, really, I look right straight in. I don't look that way. I don't look that way. Just boom, right there. That's all I do. I finally said something. You know, I felt called upon to say something sooner or later, because we got to my floor finally, and she opened the door. She said 14, so I said thank you. I turned around. I bowed to her like that. Oh, you don't want to lose your decorum in a case like this, you know. You just braze your way right through it. That's what I did. I said, thank you. I was so polite. You'd have been proud of me. You really would. I was beautiful. I turned around. I bowed to the rest of the people in the elevator. Oh, I would have tipped my hat if I'd had my hat, you know. Except I wouldn't have had it on my head if I'd had it on my
My pleasure to introduce one of the finest guys I've ever known, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jimmy Stewart. I'm sure glad you could make it back on my show.
Glad to be here.
Well, I got to tell you, I really enjoyed making that movie Bandolero with you.
I enjoyed every minute of it, Dean. You know, making pictures can be a lot of fun, but, you know, I'm really getting to enjoy television.
Well, you ought to have a show of your own like this one.
Oh, no, I couldn't never do what you do.
What do you do? Oh, heavens to Betsy, you could sure do that. Sir, you watch my show every week, don't you?
I do.
Well, just do what I do.
No, but it wouldn't come out the same, Dean.
Why don't we find out, Jimmy? You just back up there. Dorsey, back right up there.
Oh?
Yeah, we're going to find out something. And now, here's the second half of the Jimmy Stewart Show.
I think I hurt my tutu. Well, you all know my Ken pal Lane. No. you mind fixing that card there? It's my pal, Ken Lane. You know, Ken's a real topper. A trooper. He got out of sick bed to come over here with us tonight. His bed's got the flu. That's what the bed has. What are the first couple notes of that? A fine romance, my friend. This is a fine romance. Don't tell my missus. After you've gone, who'll do the dishes? Well, Ken, I guess I'm going to have to say so long and go over to the couch. But, Ken, I want you to know something, Ken. I want you to know that I think that this is... Look right at me, Ken. I want you to know, Ken, that I'll always remember you this way. And that's because I've never seen you any other way. Why, it's Dean Martin! Dean Martin!
My next guest. No, really, my next guest is a legend in show business. I was going to say he's a phenomenon in show business, but I wasn't sure I could pronounce it, but I did, and that's what he is. Ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful Mr. Shecky Greene.
Thank you. Can I tell you, not only does this man sing beautifully, but he's got a magnificent body, hasn't he? The way he's built. Do you know I got a body just like that, but it's inside this one? People keep on telling me, say, Sheck, if you only take off some weight, you look just like Dean Martin. So I went to these doctors with these diet pills. I took Dexedrine, I took thyroid pills, I took Preludin. I took them all on the same day. And I didn't lose any weight, but I didn't give a darn. I walked around going, yeah, man, I'm fat, man, yeah. Yeah, man, I'm fat. America, ladies and gentlemen, is becoming physical fitness conscious. When I was in high school even, we had a coach.
You punks, you dissipate your bodies. It's a God-given gift to have a healthy body because a healthy body's a healthy mind. I want you punks to take a look at my body, all you Utes. I want you to see this body here. I'm 48 years old. Take a look at my latissimus dorsi, my pectoral, my glutamus, you know what I mean? And you know, I got this beautiful body. I never smoked a cigarette. I never had an alcoholic drink. I never took out a woman.
And then he went completely wacky. And as they took him away, we heard him yell, get me a drunken broad that smokes. I hate this body! It's unbelievable. America. Every time you turn on television today, you get Miss World, Miss United States, Miss America, Miss International, Miss Moose. They got all these beauty pageants. And you notice a New York girl never wins these contests? Because a New York girl would sound too arrogant, too conceited. I just want to say that I saw the other 49 broads. What's to lose? Give me the trophy and let me get out of here already. I've got to go to the mountains for the weekend. It's always the southern, humble girls that bless you. I never thought I'd be the recipient of this most magnificent award. And may I say, thank you. May I say that Judge Raymond deserves this trophy more than I do. Everybody is concerned about how they look. I gotta tell you, Harry Belafonte is one of my dearest friends, unless he was here tonight. Then I wouldn't mention his name because I don't know him personally. But Harry Belafonte, I gotta tell you about this. He and I were talking one time, and I said, Harry, what is it, Chicky, Chikey, Chucky, whatever your name is? I said, Harry, how did you develop that style that you got? He said, first of all, may I tell you, my friend, my style is something that I've studied for years and years. I found out what the American public wants. They want a beautiful-looking body upon the stage. That is why when I walk out on the stage, I never wear a jacket. Here's a little trick I learned in the Navy. Always roll your clothes. And while you're doing that, somebody steals your locker. Eddie Belafonte says, I never wear a tie when I'm on stage. I did that one night and a motor started. Shecky, when I walk out on the stage, always, my shirt is unbuttoned. I let the people see my physical being because this is the thing that I sell to an audience. I says, you're right. It's your appearance. Because if you ever analyze some of the songs these people sing, these folk singers like, there's the fly that fell from the sky, there's the fly that fell from the sky, there's the fly that fell from the sky, oh, why can't the little fly fly? Well, I pick up the little fly, and now I could see the thing, that poor little fly, he's missing one of his wings. Well, I throw the fly back in the sky, but the little fly, he cannot fly, so die little fly, oh, die little fly, fly, oh, die little fly. I tell you, with folk singers, I never liked it when my own folks used to sing. My mother on a Friday night, abrivele de mame, abrivele de pape. I used to say to my father, why does Mom sing like that?
He said, I don't know, son. I've been married her 43 years. I don't know what her problem is.
I used to get the feeling a lot of times he wasn't my real dad. Especially on Sunday when he used to genuflect over the lox and bagel and get the cream cheese in his knee. I don't mind a folk singer that just stands up and sings folk songs, but the kind that I really detest are the kind that come out with a guitar. Ooh, I want to join your union. Yes. You ever see they walk out and they're always very serious? It's gonna be a long show. This thing's caught on my belt buckle here. It happened a long time ago, they say, in the middle of May in Montana. They had a terrible snowstorm. Everybody ran rocking their homes to get out of the storm, all except one little boy by the name of Benny Lipsky. He had no place to go, so he laid down in the snow. Well, he laid there overnight in the snow, and he turned blue. Wouldn't you too turn blue if you laid there over in the snow? You know you would. You turn blue overnight in the snow. If you laid there, you'd turn blue. Well, the next day, a man by the name of Gainsborough came to town, and he saw little Benny Lipsky lying around. He said, Ma, I got a wonderful idea, and he bought a frame. He put it around Benny Lipsky, and he gave it a name, the Blue Boy. Wait! I love how really serious they get. I shot a man dead, that's what they said. Shot a man dead, they said I shot a man dead. I put a bullet hole right in the middle of his head while he laid in bed. All over the sheets he bled, his name was Fred. His name was really Bill, but it didn't rhyme with bed, so I changed it to Fred. Well, they took me to jail without any bail. Took me to jail without any bail, they took me to jail without any bail. They cut my pants leg, they shaved my hair. Cut my pants leg, they shaved my hair. Cut my pants leg, they shaved my hair. They told me I'm going to the electric chair. Well, I turned to my lawyer who was standing there. I turned to my lawyer who was standing there. Turned to my lawyer who was standing there, and I asked him what to do. He said, don't sit down, don't sit down, don't sit down if I were you. Don't sit down, don't sit down, gonna make you awful black and blue. Hot damn! Hot damn!
Everybody loves somebody sometime. Everybody falls in love somehow. Something in your kiss just told me that sometime is now. Everybody finds somebody someplace. There's no telling where love may appear. Something in my heart keeps saying that someplace is